Imagine waking up to a Britain where indefinite residence, the legal status that lets someone build a life, work, and apply for citizenship, no longer exists as we know it. That is the central promise Reform UK put on the table this month. Abolish or dramatically restrict indefinite leave to remain, ILR, and replace it with shorter renewable visas. The party argues this would restore control, reduce incentives for illegal entry, and prioritize those who contribute to British society. That proposal has electrified the debate. Supporters say it's common sense. Tougher rules will stop illegal crossings, protect public services, and safeguard national identity. Critics call it cruel and destabilizing, and warn it could target people who've lived here for years. Labour has publicly branded parts of the plan racist, while the Home Secretary and other ministers are already proposing stricter residency rules of their own. So here's the question driving this video. Is Britain facing a migration and identity crisis that demands radical rethinking of residency? Or are politicians exploiting fears about religion, crime, and culture to score votes? You've heard the anxieties. Small boat crossings that dominate the headlines, stories of social friction in certain towns, and rising talk about cultural change. But how much of that anxiety is rooted in policy failure? And how much is driven by perception, media framing, and political entrepreneurs? Over the next 15 minutes, we'll unpack Reform UK's proposals, map what the public actually worries about, illegal entry versus lawful immigration, explore why religion and identity are so central to the debate, and test the claim that Britain has lost its roots. I'll also examine the risks of letting populist rhetoric drive long-term policy, and offer realistic alternatives that address security, integration, and national cohesion. Let's get into it. Let's be crystal clear. Reform UK isn't talking softly about tweaks. They're proposing a sweeping overhaul of how legal permanent residence works in the UK. If enacted, it would drastically reshape what it means to belong. At the heart of their platform is the idea that indefinite leave to remain, ILR, should be replaced by time-limited visas, likely with stricter performance thresholds. Under their plan, migrants would no longer qualify for a lifetime status after a set period. Renewal would depend on criteria such as income, language, cultural integration, and possibly clean criminal record checks. Citizenship pathways would be more restrictive, requiring even higher thresholds. They aim to reduce the backlog by limiting who qualifies, cutting down the number of people eligible for permanent status each year. Farage and his allies argue that the current system is too generous, that people can settle, claim benefits, and eventually become citizens with too little accountability. They frame it as pay to stay or earn your place in Britain. Political messaging for Reform UK paints this as fairness, that those who truly commit, contribute, and respect British values should be rewarded, while loopholes and abuse should be closed. This idea resonates with those who feel that illegal immigration and overstretched public services are symptoms of lax enforcement. Reform UK is offering a narrative: you want stability, you want rights, fine, but prove you deserve them. No open-ended promises. In their words, this isn't about cutting migration entirely. It's about quality over quantity. They also frame it as a way to boost social cohesion. By making permanent residence harder to come by, only the most willing to integrate will stay for the long haul. That, they argue, reduces community friction. But this approach raises serious questions. What happens to long, legally settled migrants who built lives under the current system? Would they be forced to reapply, or suddenly find themselves without certain benefits? Critics warn of stateless in Britain. There's also the risk of racial or economic bias. Stricter income or language tests often disproportionately exclude lower-income applicants, which may correlate with minority communities. Furthermore, the administrative burden would be enormous. The Home Office is already under pressure managing the existing ILR and visa system. Adding new layers, appeals, reapplications, auditing, would likely slow the system further or push people into legal uncertainty. Because of those tensions, we need to test whether the public concerns driving support for Reform UK, especially illegal crossings and cultural anxiety, line up with what reform is promising. Next, we'll look at why illegal migration looms so large in public perception and whether fears match reality. Every evening, the headlines flash about small boats crossing the channel, migrant boats intercepted, or asylum seekers arriving. For many Britons, that image has become the face of migration and the face of threat. Public opinion is heavily shaped by what people see and hear, and polls confirm that illegal migration draws far more concern than legal immigration. In one YouGov survey, 79% of respondents said the level of illegal migration was too high, compared with only 48% who felt legal migration was excessive. Even more striking, 47% of Britons believe there are more migrants residing in the UK illegally than legally, a belief that is widely inaccurate based on official data. That belief fuels demands for mass removals. When asked if the UK should admit no new migrants and require many who already live here to leave, 45% agreed, including 86% of Reform UK voters. But actual estimates place the number of illegal migrants in the UK between 120,000 and 1.3 million, depending on source, compared to over 10 million legal migrants according to the Census and Migration Studies. That's a big mismatch between perception and statistical reality. So why does illegal migration dominate the public imagination? Because it feels uncontrolled. Legal immigration is regulated, visible, and often silent. Border crossings in small boats dramatize loss of control. They invoke images of chaos, porous borders, and threat. Politicians and media repeatedly frame these arrivals as security risks, pressure on public services, and lack of integration. That narrative intensifies fear of cultural dilution, especially when newcomers are seen exhibiting religious or cultural practices perceived as foreign. In that context, Reform UK's messaging taps directly into fear. If the boats keep coming and public resources feel squeezed, people want a hardline answer. The proposal to remove ILR and insist on stricter visas appears to many as a measure of ultimate control, closing loopholes, making settlement harder, and ensuring only those who fit stay. But the fear-driven narrative hides important nuance. First, not all arrivals via boats stay. Many are intercepted, returned, or denied asylum. Second, legal immigration for work, study, family far outpaces illegal flows in terms of volume and day-to-day impact on communities. Third, public concern often conflates religion, ethnicity, and cultural practices as if illegal migration implies religious threat. But the statistical link is weak or absent in mainstream data. Polling also shows that while many want to curb illegal migration, support crumbles when you specify who would be removed. Only 29% support removing ILR from current holders, 58% oppose that. And when asked about deporting asylum seekers who came through legal channels, or skilled workers, support drops sharply. So as reform's proposals resonate, they ride on a shaky bridge of perception, one built on fear, media framing, and political momentum. Next, we'll dig into how religion and identity get drawn into this debate. Not just as background but as central axes around which people interpret migration and belonging. That's where things get more emotionally combustible, and where your view about religion's role will enter the conversation. Talk to people about immigration long enough and the conversation often shifts, from numbers and visas to values, culture, and religion. Not always explicitly. Sometimes it's in code, community cohesion, shared values, cultural fit. But often, especially online or in fringe media, the concern is direct, that Britain is facing a cultural shift, one shaped by Islam. For some Britons, religion isn't just a private belief, it's a marker of national identity. In this view, Britain's cultural foundation is Christian, even if most citizens today aren't churchgoers. Christmas, the monarchy, the legal system, even the national anthem are all tied, symbolically at least, to Christianity. That's why when migrants arrive from predominantly Muslim countries, particularly via irregular means, public concern often spikes. These newcomers are seen as visibly religious, with strong community ties, public expressions of faith, and growing political presence. That visibility makes some locals feel that their cultural space is being displaced. Some critics argue that Muslim communities are too assertive in expressing their beliefs. Through dress, prayer in public, mosque presence, and activism, they point to protests over LGBTQ education in schools, prayer on public streets, or gender segregation in some religious settings. They say, we couldn't get away with this if we were Christian. But it's also true that Britain is a secular democracy. Legally, people are free to worship, organize, and express their beliefs, as long as they don't incite violence or break the law. So the tension becomes this: how much religious expression is too much before it feels like imposition? And who gets to decide? Here's where nuance matters. The overwhelming majority of British Muslims, 3.9 million people, live peacefully, work, contribute, and follow the law. According to government data and studies by groups like the Runnymede Trust, British Muslims are less likely to commit crimes than the general population on average, though they are more likely to be economically disadvantaged. Yes, some radical groups exist, as they do in every religion and ideology. But equating all Muslim migrants with extremism is not only factually wrong, it risks further alienation, pushing people toward the very fringes society fears. It's a feedback loop. Reform UK and others often stop short of addressing this complexity. They focus on numbers and borders, but the emotional heart of the debate, cultural fear, goes unspoken. If Britain wants to stand for something, as some argue, that must include a clearer articulation of what those values are: secularism, tolerance, or Christian heritage. Because without defining what being British actually means in 2025 and beyond, immigration, especially from Muslim-majority countries, will continue to be filtered through fear, not facts. If Reform UK threw a match into the political powder keg with their ILR proposal, the reactions were just as explosive. Politicians scrambled to either condemn or compete, and in the process, exposed how deeply fractured the immigration debate has become. Labour, now in government under Prime Minister Keir Starmer, swiftly denounced the proposal. Senior cabinet ministers called it dangerous, divisive, and a betrayal of modern British values. They argued that stripping away the stability of indefinite leave to remain would punish legally settled families, disrupt workforce planning, and inject fear into migrant communities. Starmer was blunt. We need strong borders, yes, but we don't need fear-driven policies that target the innocent. Despite that firm stance, political pressure is mounting. Reform UK's surge in support is putting heat on Labour from both ends. Some Red Wall MPs worry that Labour risks looking out of touch in areas where voters perceive immigration as linked to cultural change. A few have even floated ideas about tightening future ILR criteria, a sign that Labour may not be immune to populist pressure. The Conservatives, now in opposition, are also shifting strategy. Right-leaning voices are embracing elements of Reform's messaging to reclaim territory. Figures like Suella Braverman and Robert Jenrick have hinted that Labour's open-door stance won't hold, and that the public still wants migration numbers slashed and national values protected. But perhaps the most alarming trend isn't in Westminster, it's online. Far-right figures from Tommy Robinson to obscure Telegram influencers have latched onto Reform UK's messaging. They interpret it as the first step in reclaiming a British identity under threat. And although Reform UK insists it is non-racist and pro-British, their talking points are repackaged by extremists as a gateway to racial nationalism and cultural panic. Scroll through the replies on social media and you'll find calls for mosque bans, reverse migration, and talk of a Britain being invaded. This is where fear becomes weaponized, and where mainstream politicians risk being pulled into dangerous territory. The urgent question is, can Britain talk honestly about migration without feeding the radical fringe? What does it mean to be British in 2025? That question hangs over every immigration debate, and yet no party seems eager to answer it directly. Britain today is more diverse, more secular, and more global than ever before. But for many, something feels lost in the process. Supporters of tighter immigration don't just talk about numbers. They talk about identity. About a nation that's unrecognizable from the one they grew up in. About shared values fading. Some point to Christianity, or Britain's Christian heritage, as a unifying force. Not in church attendance, but in everyday culture. School assemblies, holidays, charitable values, the legal system. Love thy neighbor wasn't just scripture, it was public consensus. Now, with over half the population identifying as non-religious and multiple faiths visible in public life, Britain is freer, but also more fragmented. Diversity can be a strength, but without a shared moral foundation, cultural cohesion, phrase. Here's the crux. If Britain no longer celebrates its roots, can it really ask newcomers to embrace them? It's a tough question, because if permanent residency and citizenship imply integration, then society must define what people are integrating into. The irony? Many fear being overtaken by religious conservatism, while rejecting their own spiritual foundations. A prime minister who doesn't profess belief in God, a culture uneasy with faith, public life allergic to moral certainty, even when it's grounded in values like honesty, responsibility, and respect. So maybe the crisis isn't just about migration, maybe it's about meaning. And if Britain doesn't know who it is, can it really know who should belong? What does the future hold for Britain if current trends continue? Demographers project that if birth rates, migration levels, and religious affiliation continue on their current trajectory, Islam could become the UK's largest religion within 40-50 years. Not because of conquest, but because of population dynamics and secular drift among non-Muslims. This isn't speculation, it's data. The 2021 census showed a sharp decline in people identifying as Christian and a steady rise in those identifying as Muslim. At the same time, the no-religion category is growing even faster. But here's the twist: many faith communities are more cohesive, family-oriented, and publicly active than secular ones. If cultural institutions continue to shy away from any shared values, and if political leadership refuses to define what Britain stands for, then the cultural vacuum will be filled by whoever is most assertive. That could be Muslims, Christians, secular humanists, or something entirely new. But if society drifts without clear civic values, the future won't just be different, it could be unrecognizable to those who grew up believing in a shared national identity. The time to shape that future, thoughtfully and honestly, is now. So where does all this leave us? Reform UK's push to scrap indefinite leave to remain isn't just a policy proposal, it's a signal. A signal that millions feel unheard, uncertain, and uneasy about the direction Britain is heading. Whether you agree with the policy or not, you can't ignore the emotion behind it. But here's the danger. If we let fear dominate the national conversation, we risk choosing division over direction. We risk letting extremes define who belongs and who doesn't. Britain needs a better debate, one that acknowledges public concern about immigration and integration without demonizing entire communities. One that protects borders, but also protects principles. One that defines what it means to be British, not just legally but culturally. That conversation won't come from headlines or hashtags, it starts with people, with you. So here's the challenge: demand better. From your leaders, from your media, and from yourself. If you care about Britain's future, not just its demographics, but its identity, then speak up, stay informed, and shape the conversation before someone else does it for you. Subscribe, like, and share, and let's talk about what comes next.